In 2017, a team of geneticists submitted a paper to a major peer-reviewed journal. The paper had been 2 years in the making. It analyzed ancient skeletal remains pulled from burial mounds scattered across what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Mounds that had been sitting in plain sight for over 1,000 years. 3 peer reviewers received the manuscript. 2 approved it immediately. The third asked for the paper to be quietly shelved, not because the science was wrong, because of what the DNA was pointing to. That paper was eventually published. What it revealed has quietly reshaped how geneticists think about the deep roots of Black American ancestry, and almost nobody is talking about it. To understand why this discovery hit so hard, you need to understand what researchers expected to find. The mound builders, as archaeologists call them, are one of the most misunderstood civilizations in North American history. These were not small nomadic bands scraping out a living. At their peak, between roughly 100 BCE and 1600 CE, mound builder cultures stretched across the entire eastern half of North America. The largest of their sites, Cahokia, located just outside modern St. Louis, housed more than 20,000 people AT its height. That made it larger than London was in the same era. They engineered massive earthwork complexes, traded obsidian and copper across thousands of miles, and built burial chambers that preserved the dead with extraordinary precision. And then, catastrophically, mysteriously, the civilization collapsed. By the time European colonizers arrived, most of the mounds had already been abandoned for generations. The people who built them had scattered. Archaeologists had assumed for decades that the descendants of the mound builders were absorbed into the indigenous nations that survived into the modern era. The Muscogee, the Cherokee, the Choctaw. That assumption seemed logical. It seemed safe. The DNA said otherwise. Researchers from the University of Oklahoma and the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History extracted ancient DNA from 30 full skeletal remains recovered from burial mounds across Alabama's Black Warrior River Valley. The remains ranged in age from roughly 800 CE to 400 CE, right at the height of the Mississippian culture, the most sophisticated phase of mound builder civilization. The team ran full genomic sequencing. They compared the ancient profiles against a database of over 6,200 modern individuals from 142 populations worldwide. They were looking for descendants. They were looking for continuity. The first result was not controversial. The Snort's ancient Alabama remains showed strong genetic similarity to modern indigenous populations in the southeastern United States. The Muscogee connection held up. That was expected. But then the analysis went deeper. And when the team ran the ancient DNA against a second comparison group, one that had not been included in the original study, design added only after a team member raised the question, the numbers came back in a way that stopped the lab cold. The ancient mound builder genomes showed a statistically significant genetic affinity with present-day African-Americans from the Deep South. Not all African-Americans, specifically. And this is the part that required 3 additional months of verification before anyone would say it out loud. African Americans whose families had been enslaved in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia for multiple generations. Now, before you assume this is about slavery-era mixing, it is not. That was the first thing the team checked. The signal they were seeing was not the expected genetic signature of 18th or 19th century admixture events. It was older, much older, and it was pointing somewhere that the field of population genetics had never seriously looked. To understand what that means, you need to know something about how ancient DNA works. When a population occupies a specific geography, music, for centuries, they leave a genetic signature in the soil, in the remains, in the regional gene pool. Even after population displacement, conquest, or forced migration, fragments of that signature can persist, embedded in the descendants of people who shared space, shared food, shared generations with the original population. Geneticists call these fragments ghost signals. They are not the dominant ancestry. They are the residue, the echo. If you're watching this and that sentence just changed something in how you see American history, hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part that made one peer reviewer want to kill this paper entirely. Because the team's next question was not about what the DNA contained. It was about what the DNA implied about the timeline. The timeline question started with a simple data discrepancy that the team almost dismissed as noise. When the researchers mapped the genetic affinity between the ancient Alabama remains and modern Deep South African amines, they expected the signal, if it was real at all, to cluster around a specific historical window, the late 1700s through the mid-1800s, the period when enslaved Africans and their descendants had the most sustained documented contact with indigenous populations, music, in the southeastern United States. The 5 civilized tribes had enslaved black people. Intermarriage happened, shared communities formed, Genetics from that era of contact would show up in the data as a relatively recent admixture music layer. Identifiable, datable, explainable. That is not what they found. The genetic signal did not cluster in the post-contact window. It clustered earlier, significantly earlier. When the team applied molecular dating techniques to the shared genomic segments, specifically by measuring the length of identical by descent segments, music, which shortened predictably with each passing generation, the data pointed to an admixture event occurring somewhere between 600 and music 900 CE, 600 to 900 CE. That is not the era of slavery. That is not the era of colonization. That is the height of the woodland to Misophian music transition. Centuries before Christopher Columbus was born, centuries before the first enslaved African set foot on American music soil. The team sat on that number for 6 weeks before publishing it. Because it raised a question, the T has no clean answer, music in any current historical model. If the genetic connection between mound builder populations and the ancestors of music, deep South African Americans, predates the transatlantic slave trade by nearly 1,000 years, then who exactly were the people being buried in those Alabama mounds? Here is where the story gets complicated in ways that mainstream American historiography, music, is not fully equipped to handle. The foundational premise of music, every textbook account of American prehistory, has always been that sub-Saharan African populations had no meaningful presence in the Americas before music 1492. That is not a fringe claim. That is settled doctrine. The Bering Strait migration model positions the first Americans as descendants of northeastern Asian populations who crossed into Alaska between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. That model is real. The genetic evidence for it is robust. But here is what that model has never fully resolved. Music. The anomalous genetic and skeletal data that keeps surfacing at pre-Columbian sites across South America, the Caribbean, and now apparently the American Southeast. In 2021, researchers at Harvard's Reich Lab, one of the most respected ancient DNA laboratories in the world, published a large-scale genomic study of pre-Columbian populations across the Americas. Buried in the supplementary data of that paper was a finding that received almost no press coverage. Music, several, particular question. They moved on. The Alabama data does not sit in isolation. That is the point Dr. Mooney and her colleagues were careful to make in their published paper. They were not claiming a pre-Columbian African presence in North America. They were not making any claim about origin or migration route. What they were saying, what the data was saying, was that the genetic architecture and music of certain deep South African American communities contained a non-trivial signal of ancient American ancestry, music, that could not be fully explained by documented post-Columbian contact events alone. Some researchers began asking the next logical question out loud. If the admixture signal predates music 1492, and it is specifically tied to mound builder burial populations in Alabama, then music, one of 3 things, has to be true. Either the molecular dating methodology is flawed, music, which the team tested for and ruled out at a 94% confidence interval, or there was sustained undocumented genetic exchange between populations in the pre-Columbian Southeast music and populations carrying West African genetic signatures, or, and this is the interpretation, music that peer reviewer number 3 found professionally dangerous. HLO group A2 in its standard form, music, is an indigenous American lineage. It is not African. It is not European. It is pre-Columbian American. 11% of sampled. Individuals in one of the most historically isolated African American communities, music in the country, were carrying a mitochondrial signature that traced directly to pre-Cont America, passed down through an unbroken maternal line. 11% is not noise, that is music, not contamination. That number, if it holds in larger samples, means that tens of thousands of African Americans living in Alabama today carry direct genetic inheritance from the women who were buried in those mounds. Not metaphorically, not culturally, biologically, in the mitochondrial DNA that every person on Earth, music, inherits exclusively from their mother, which her mother inherited from her mother, stretching back in an unbroken chain to a woman who lived in this landscape, music, over 1,000 years ago, and was laid to rest beneath a mound of earth that is still standing today. The implications of that finding reach in several music directions at once, and not all of them are comfortable. The first implication is historical, if significant. Numbers of African Americans in the music Deep South descend maternally directly from mound builder populations. Then the standard narrative of Black American origins requires music, a fundamental revision. The story, told for generations, that Black American identity begins with music. The middle passage with Africa, with the horror of the slave trade, is not wrong, but it may be incomplete in a way that nobody anticipated. There may be a chapter of this story that music predates 1619 by 6 centuries, a chapter written in the soil of Alabama, in the bones of people whose names we do not know, whose language has not survived, whose civilization collapsed before anyone thought to record music it. But that is only the first implication, because the second implication is the one the field is even less prepared to discuss. The second implication is about identity, music, specifically about who gets to claim this land. For centuries, the legal and cultural framework of the United States music has operated on a binary. There were indigenous peoples whose ancestral connection to North American soil, music, predated European arrival. And there were African Amins, whose ancestors were forcibly brought to that same soil against their will, stripped of every prior connection and told implicitly and explicitly that they were newcomers here, arrivals, that their relationship to this land began in chains and nothing more. The Alabama data does not erase that history. Nothing erases that music history. But it introduces a biological complication that legal scholars, tribal enrollment offices, and identity politics have no existing framework to music process. If a measurable percentage of deep South African Amines carry pre-Columbian indigenous music ancestry passed down through unbroken maternal lineages, ancestry that ties them genetically to the people, music, who built these mounds, who farmed the soil, who organized complex societies on this specific landscape over 1,000 years, music ago, then the question of indigenous connection becomes considerably less binary than anyone has been willing to admit. Some researchers have begun raising this point in music, academic contexts, carefully and quietly. The conversations tend to, music, stop quickly. The political risk is too high on every side. Indigenous nations have fought decades-long legal battles to protect tribal music citizenship from being diluted or exploited by people claiming distant native ancestry, music, without cultural community or genealogical documentation. The history of non-Native Americans, falsely music, claiming indigenous identity is long and corrosive. Nobody wants to open music that door wider. And yet the DNA does not care about the politics. The DNA just is what the researchers were careful to emphasize. Music, and this point gets lost in the more sensational readings of their work, is that genetic ancestry and cultural identity are music, not the same thing. A haplogroup variant is not a tribal membership card carrying mitochondrial A2. Alabama does not. Music make someone Muskogee or Cherokee or legal heir to any specific indigenous nation. The cultural, legal, music, and political dimensions of indigenous identity involve community, language, lineage, documentation, and sovereign recognition, none of which a genome can, music, grant or replace. The science itself is neutral. What we choose to do with that evidence is a different question entirely. Music, and one that scientists are not equipped to answer alone. But here's the crucial point that gets lost in these debates. The second implication, they were asking something more fundamental. They were asking whether the standard telling of Black American history has been not falsified but truncated, whether the experience of enslavement was so total, so deliberately destructive of music prior, identity that it erased not just cultural memory, but the awareness of biological memory that was sitting right there in the DNA the whole time. Enslaved music people in Alabama were forced to live, work, and die on top of the literal graves of their partial ancestors. Music. Some of them may have carried in their own bodies a genetic inheritance from the civilization whose mounds they were, made to plow around, ignore music, and occasionally demolish for farmland. They would have had no way of knowing that the knowledge, music systems, that might have preserved that memory, oral traditions, community genealogies, sacred geography, were systematically destroyed by the machinery music of slavery. What the DNA is doing, in a sense, is recovering a fragment of music what that destruction erased. That framing is not the paper's conclusion. The authors do not go music there, but it is where the data points when you follow it far enough. Now, music here is where the story takes one final unexpected turn. In the 2 years following the paper's publication, 3 music independent research teams attempted to replicate and expand the findings using larger sample sets. The results were not uniform. Music 1. Team working out of Vanderbilt University found a similar but weaker A2 signal in music, a Tennessee African Amine cohort present but at roughly half the frequency of the Alabama group. A second team, using a broader GF Coast sample, music, found no statistically significant signal at all. The third team, drawing specifically from historically documented freedmen, communities in Mississippi, descendants of people enslaved, music by the 5 civilized tribes, found a signal even stronger than the original Alabama study. Music. What those 3 outcomes together suggest is that this is not a continent-wide phenomenon with a single clean explanation. It is regional, It is community specific. It is tied music to, well, not a single dramatic event, not a pre-Columbian migration story, but the slow, ordinary music genetic consequence of people sharing a landscape across hundreds of years. That is actually the more music important story, not the headline version, not the impossible sounding implication, the quieter truth underneath it. Music, human. Beings have always mixed. They have always moved. They have always left pieces of themselves in the populations they lived alongside, traded with, music, married into, and were buried near. The idea that the people who built the Alabama mounds were genetically sealed off from every other human population until European contact, music, that their DNA stayed pristine and categorically separate until history decided otherwise, was always an assumption, not a finding. The data is now slowly correcting that assumption. And what the correction reveals is not a scandal. It is not a conspiracy. Music is just the normal, relentless biological reality of human beings living near each other, across time. The burial mounds of Alabama are still there, more than 300 of them scattered across the Black Warrior Valley. Some music intact, many damaged, a few excavated and studied. Most simply prisons rising out of the landscape the way they have for over 1,000 years. Music. And somewhere in the communities that surround them, in families that have lived in that same red dirt geography for generations, the people who built those mounds left something behind that no amount of history, not colonization, not slavery, not forced erasure, managed to fully extinguish. That is what the DNA found. Not a conspiracy, not a rewritten textbook, just evidence that the past is longer than the story we were told, that the connections between people run deeper than the categories we use to organize them, and that the ground beneath our feet remembers things that we have forgotten how to ask about. This is not the end of the research. It is barely the beginning. Larger studies are already underway. The questions this paper opened are going to take decades to answer fully, if they can be answered at all. But the fact that music, the questions are finally being asked, that the data is finally being collected, that the burial mounds of Alabama are finally being understood as something more than archaeological curiosities, that matters. That is the shift. If this changed something in how you think about American history and who belongs to it, hit-like, it genuinely helps this research reach people who need to hear it. Music. And drop in the comments, did this match what you expected, or did the timeline catch you off guard? I want to know what hit hardest for you. Now, I already went music deep on scientists compared Black American, found we're not supposed to be possible. Watch that next. The past is not behind us. It is in us.